Hello, everyone. This is D. Knight, author of A Realistic Path to Peace: How to End the New Cold War and Prevent Nuclear Disaster. In this session, I zero in on what can be considered the crux of the matter, the new, tougher realities the neocon war planners are confronting, and how they propose to deal with them. It shows, I think, how wildly unrealistic they are. I include my own comments at the end, which I think are more realistic. For the neocon war planners in Washington, D.C., new realities have become a constant challenge. A Washington Post headline blared in April 2023 that the U.S.'s gloominess on war in Ukraine is now clear to see. The story said U.S. officials have privately conveyed their concerns, pointing to a tougher reality. A total military victory for Ukraine seemed impossible. The military-industrial base in Western countries required to sustain the flow of foreign munitions and arms to the front was under severe strain, and at some point the support of Western publics, especially Americans, would wane, and the spigot gushing tens of billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine would get turned off. But another April article in the Post said negotiations to end the conflict are unlikely during 2023 in all considered scenarios. The war in Ukraine will likely drift into 2024 with no resolution in sight. The gloom reflected a Defense Intelligence Agency assessment that was among the highly sensitive U.S. government materials leaked in early April. About that leak, President Biden said, "I'm concerned that it happened, but there is nothing contemporaneous that I'm aware of that is of great consequence." Meanwhile, Secretary of State Blinken vehemently rejected any attempts to cast doubt on Ukraine's capacity to win on the battlefield. Foreign Affairs, the flagship publication of the prestigious Council on Foreign Relations, issued its own view at that time. The West needs a new strategy in Ukraine, they said, a plan for getting from the battlefield to the negotiating table. It is difficult to feel sanguine about where the war is headed, they write, and while calls for a diplomatic end to the conflict are understandably growing, conditions are not yet ripe for a negotiated settlement. The approach Foreign Affairs proposed is first bolstering Ukraine's military capability, and then, when the fighting season winds down late this year, ushering Moscow and Kiev from the battlefield to the negotiating table. Before any ushering from the battlefield would take place, the Council leaders say it's time for the West to stop deterring itself and help Ukraine more militarily, with tanks, long-range missiles, and other weapons, and also begin training Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16 fighter jets. But the authors acknowledge that the war is eroding the West's military readiness and depleting its weapons stockpiles. The defense industrial base cannot keep up with Ukraine's expenditure of equipment and ammunition. NATO countries cannot discount the possibility of direct hostilities with Russia, and the United States must prepare for potential military action in Asia and the Middle East. They add that the war is imposing high costs on the global economy, and economic duress is triggering political unrest and is also polarizing the international system. Against this backdrop, they say neither Ukraine nor its NATO supporters can take Western unity for granted. Washington faces mounting pressure to reduce spending, rebuild U.S. readiness, and bulk up its capabilities in Asia. With Republicans in control of the House of Representatives, getting more aid for Ukraine is now harder, and policy toward Ukraine could change significantly should Republicans win the White House in 2024. It's time to ready a Plan B, they say. Here's their Plan B. Washington should start consultations with its European allies and with Kiev on a diplomatic initiative to be launched later in the year. Ukraine's Western supporters would propose a ceasefire. Ideally, both Ukraine and Russia would pull back their troops and heavy weapons, effectively creating a demilitarized zone. a neutral organization, either the UN or the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, would send in observers. The West would approach other influential countries, including China and India, to support the ceasefire proposal. The West could also offer some limited relief from sanctions in return for Russia's willingness to abide by a ceasefire, agree to a demilitarized zone, and participate meaningfully in peace talks. Ukraine, they assure us, would enter such negotiations by demanding its top priorities: the restoration of its 1991 borders, substantial reparations, and accountability for war crimes. But because Putin would surely reject these demands out of hand, a prolonged diplomatic stalemate would then emerge, effectively producing a new frozen conflict. Ideally, the ceasefire would hold, leading to a status quo like the one that prevails on the Korean Peninsula. So foreign affairs wants a demilitarized zone and a prolonged diplomatic stalemate in Ukraine, something like the division of Korea 7 decades ago. That is not peace. The U.S. war in Korea never ended. The United States has continued to isolate, really strangle, its enemy in the north of Korea, while fostering a client state in Korea's southern half with a huge military establishment controlled operationally by the U.S., including nuclear weapons aimed at North Korea, China, and Russia. If the foreign affairs writers think Russia would accept such a deal, they haven't been reading the Pentagon's leaked intelligence reports. In realistic terms, the Ukrainian forces and their NATO backers are exhausted. Russian forces are establishing security for Russian speakers in eastern and southern Ukraine and defending their self-determination. In effect, they are implementing the Minsk Accords, which all parties agreed 2 years ago. In the 7 decades since the armed truce in Korea, a lot has changed. Most importantly, China is no longer exhausted from a century of humiliation and 3 decades of revolutionary war. Its leader, Xi Jinping, recently returned from an historic visit to Moscow, where he reaffirmed China's close friendship with Russia. Just before that, China's top diplomat presented a 12-point peace plan to the West at the Munich Security Conference. Then the presidents of France and the European Commission visited Beijing to secure economic ties with China. Germany's leader had done the same a few months earlier. Europe trades more with China than the U.S. The Chinese newspaper Global Times reported that French President Macron emphasized that the great risk Europe faces is that it gets caught up in crises that are not ours, which prevents it from building its strategic autonomy. The paradox would be that, overcome with panic, we, Europeans, believe we are just America's followers. The Global Times report says the French president's rational plea for Europe jams the brakes on some Eastern European nations and European Parliament, lured by the U.S. in their attempt to lead the continent astray. Macron is warning Europe not to go so far on this issue and risk damaging Europe's own interests. On April 14th, Brazil's President Lula da Silva met with Chinese President Xi Jinping as part of a 5-day state visit. The New York Times report was headlined, "Brazil's Lula meets Xi in China as they seek path to peace in Ukraine." Their joint statement said negotiation is the only viable way out of the crisis in Ukraine. They want China's 12-point peace plan to be the basis for talks. The Times report highlights that China has not suggested Russian forces must withdraw from occupied Ukrainian territory. Lula also wants other countries like South Africa, India, and Indonesia to help mediate the conflict. They also have not signed on to isolating Russia. Just before hosting these high-level visits from France, the EU, and Brazil, China hosted the leaders of Iran and Saudi Arabia, scoring possibly the most significant peace agreement of this century so far. No military guarantees were needed to convince Iran and Saudi Arabia to abandon hostilities. Instead, the parties agreed to peace on the basis of cooperation in attractive trade deals with China. It's a new idea, right out of China's Global Security Initiative concept paper. Of course, there's no guarantee that a similar approach could work for peace between Russia and Ukraine, or Russia and the EU and NATO. In all these cases, the main obstacle is the United States, which does not want peace based on mutual cooperation. But the U.S. may not have a choice. Its European allies could still decide to abandon the NATO alliance for their own survival. The people of Europe are calling for such a solution. That's the message of the massive protests that are sweeping Europe. They need the people of the United States to also demand such a solution. That would bring the day of reckoning for U.S. hegemony closer. The U.S. will no longer be able to control the world. As U.S. hegemony wanes, new possibilities will emerge across the globe and here at home. The maniacs in Washington may try to do what they've done before, using extreme measures to hold back change. But popular forces in this country, in Europe, and around the world can and must intervene to protect our interests and make change happen. That's how I conclude A Realistic Path to Peace. There's more, including an afterword that focuses on the actual U.S. political situation. I hope you like it. To see more, go to my book's website, realpathtopeace.com, and send your comments and questions to info@realpathtopeace.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much. Bye for now.